Hey everyone, Tin Man here, back with a guide to the second Underlord character currently available in Dota Underlords, Hobgen, the Arson Aficionado. Now, Hobgen stands in stark contrast to Nesix, who we covered in a guide yesterday. Rather than heal and let companions deal out the damage, Hobgen prefers to do the dirty work himself and set enemies on fire with his auto attacks and deal massive damage with his abilities. His auto attacks apply the On Fire debuff for 3 seconds, which burns units for 2.5% of their maximum health every second as pure damage. This makes him scale exceptionally well into the late game when opposing units are leveled up and have tons of health. His first ability, Explosivo, targets a unit and then deals a large chunk of magic damage split between that unit and all opponents adjacent to it. This sets them all on fire and generates even more hype for Hobgen. This magic damage is amplified by the Mage Alliance, making Hobgen a great pairing with a mage composition. Some of his talents are also great for mages or other spellcasters as well. His second ability, Supercharged, will give a massive attack speed buff to a friendly unit, but does set them on fire, dealing damage to them over time. He always casts this on the nearest friendly unit, and this lets you control the buff to some extent so that it goes on the best unit for you. This ability makes him very good with savages, as the extra attack speed allows them to ramp up their alliance bonus faster. Let's talk about some of the general strategy behind Hobgen. Of course, he is a high damage dealing Underlord, so by the late game, he's going to be dealing a substantial chunk of the damage for your composition. And he definitely scales best into the late game, in part due to the burn, but also due to the massively powerful talents that he has access to on rounds 30 and 35. He'll do a lot of damage on his own, doesn't really need the help of your team, but he can buff other units with the attack speed from Supercharged, which makes him a great addition to Savage compositions, as discussed before, but also can pair well with Hunters, Assassins, Brutes, even Knights, or any composition that has an individual hyper carry, such as Luna for Knights, Lifestealer or Magnus for Brutes, or just any of the Assassins. Since he has a lot of auto attacks himself, he also pairs well with the Heartless bonus, since some of his abilities just increase his attack speed and let him deal lots of physical damage in addition to the magic and pure damage he dishes out. And of course, he goes well with mages, since his main ability, Explosivo, does magic damage. Some of the pros and cons of Hobgen versus a Nesix as the current choice. For pros, we've got very high late game damage output, which a Nesix kind of falls off at. We have the multi-target silence as well as other very powerful talents starting on round 30. And the Supercharged works well into many different compositions. He's really a very flexible Underlord that can be used in a lot of different ways. The downside, though, he's definitely weaker in the early game than a Nesix, where a Nesix has comparable damage output, but she also brings a big heal to the early game that Hobgen simply can't match. He also has fairly long cast times on some of his abilities, so while he's casting Explosivo or Supercharged, he's not auto-attacking, which means he's not spreading his fire debuff, he's not dealing the pure damage over time, so these long cast times can also get disrupted with stuns or silence effects, making him start the cast again, and it can be a little bit inefficient. He also has less direct alliance synergies than a Nesix, where a Nesix likes the demons and also synergizes well with healers. The Hobgen synergizes a bit more indirectly with most alliances. Let's talk about the talent choices that you're going to have offered. On round 10, you have the option of Burning Down the House, Pyrotechnics, God of Light, or Firebreak. As for Burning Down the House, this is a good default pick in this tier. It allows you to easily spread the fire debuff against opponents who are stacked up. This increases Hobgen's damage from the fire debuff and also increases his hype generation. Everything about this talent is just great. Pyrotechnics is a pretty good talent if you're going for a mage build or other builds who need lots of mana. There'll almost always be several opponents on fire, so any kill will give your unit some mana. Although mage builds often don't get too many kills until they already cast their first round of spells, meaning the mana gain might be a little bit less useful at that point. God of Light, this talent is great for some late game situations, especially for warrior builds who can use the Supercharge to buff up backline damage dealers like Arc Warden, Troll Warlord, or Venomancer. Because Supercharge does not cast until later in the fight though, it has slightly lower impact than Burning Down the House, which takes effect right away. Firebreak, this is great for assassin builds, or where you don't have a really good front line to protect your supercharged targets. Ideally though, the supercharged units are not going to be taking too much damage if your front line can hold up, making this talent a little bit less ideal. On round 15, you've got the option of Greasefire, Implosion, Kaboom, and Hot Rod. Greasefire, this will be a moderate increase to your hype generation, contributing more if your opponents are more closely stacked up. Hobgen's ultimate abilities are very strong, so generating the extra hype is very powerful, but it can be countered if your opponents see that you have this ability and then just spread out in anticipation of it. Implosion, if your opponents are spread out, well, this ability punishes them by multiplying the damage on the primary target of Explosivo. But it doesn't amplify the damage on the adjacent targets who all share the damage. That means if there's more than one target hit, the worse that this talent becomes. This can be useful for mage composition since it does increase the magic damage of Hobgen's abilities. Kaboom! This talent works best if you're planning to supercharge your frontliners and other melee units rather than your backline damage dealers. You'll want to position Hobgen a little bit closer to the front to ensure that he supercharges the front line if you're using Kaboom. And Hot Rod, this is a very strong talent for the tier and one of the ones that I default to the most. Hot Rod increases the damage output from his auto attacks rather substantially, and it also pairs very well with Burning Down the House from round 10, as faster auto attacks mean more spreading the fire debuff. If you have a Heartless buff as well, this makes Hobgen a very potent damage dealer, but if you're playing something like mages or more caster heavy, then it might be best to pick another talent on this tier to maximize his magic damage output instead. On round 20, you get access to one of his two ultimate abilities, Let's Go Crazy or Friendly Fire. For Let's Go Crazy, this talent looks great on paper as it pairs very well with the attack speed ones before, Burning Down the House and Hot Rod. But in practice, by the time that this is cast later into the fight, because you need to generate 100 hype first, Hobgen will spend a lot of time casting his other abilities, Explosivo and Supercharged, and less time auto-attacking. In very long fights where you have a very strong front line and maybe some healing, possibly a Heartless buff, this can win out over Friendly Fire. But in most compositions, I think Friendly Fire is a better option. It has a quicker cast and will deal damage over time and doesn't rely on Hobgen to continue auto-attacking. In the faster fights, without a lot of healing and tankiness, the quicker damage output of Friendly Fire will have it beat out Let's Go Crazy. On round 25, you get the option of Afterburn, which is honestly a fairly low impact ability. It only affects one square on the board, which was the square where the center of Explosivo was targeted, and it only deals relatively low damage. It's rare that this is the correct pick, especially considering the higher impact of other talents on this tier. Drain Bomb, this one's pretty interesting. It can hurt the opposing Underlord by stealing 50 hype and essentially preventing them from doing anything for a long while. The mana denial is pretty good as well, but ideally you want to hit the Underlord with this since denying 50 hype is really big. Since the targeting is somewhat random, you can't always ensure that you're going to hit the Underlord though, making this talent a little bit inconsistent. Feedback Loop, which says that your units gain mana from damage caused by abilities, and upon casting they deal damage equal to the mana cost to adjacent enemies, is a really great talent for mages, who can quickly regain mana after casting their spells. It's particularly potent for units like Puck, Morphling, Bristleback, and Necrophos, who have low cooldown, damaging spells. Even if you have a few units that benefit, you should highly consider picking up Feedback Loop. Molten Armor, the last option in this tier, makes Hobgen a rather effective frontliner as he gains a lot of armor and sets his attackers on fire, kind of like Viper with the Dragon bonus, where he gains that defensive ability but then also deals damage back to the attackers. He can draw some initial attacks and then set a lot of enemies on fire right away and generate a lot of hype. It is a little bit dangerous though for him to be exposed, since if he dies, he can't use any of that hype that he's generated, and it will also grant additional hype generation for the opposing Underlord. This can be used to protect him against assassins though, if they're trying to jump onto your backline while he's in the back. On round 30, you have the option of Shockwave, which stuns enemies in the middle of Explosivo and then also pushes them away from the main target. And this is really ideal if you have an opposing composition like Hunters or Knights, where they're all going to be clumped up all the time, and you can really disrupt that formation quite well. But in reality, the stun is fairly short, and some of the other talents in this tier are slightly more appealing. Spark is really cool in a mage composition, as it resets the cooldown on a unit such as Keeper of the Light or other magic damage dealer. It can also be pretty good on the long cooldown units like Tidehunter, Lone Druid, or Io, but positioning Hobgen to consistently supercharge those units can be a little bit of a challenge as they move throughout the fight. Keep it secret. This is probably the best talent on the tier and possibly the best talent out of any of the Underlords talents. It's just so incredibly impactful in the late game. When paired with Burn the House Down, you can quickly silence a lot of the opponent's front lines, denying key abilities such as Tiny's Toss or Tidehunter's Ravage. Explosiveville also becomes an AoE silence, making this just an amazing talent against almost every opponent. Melting Point, this seems like it would be good with Hunter's composition to shred the opponent's armor while they're on fire, or any other build that relies on physical damage. But in reality, the fire debuff really doesn't last too long, and the armor shred's kind of minimal. While Hobgen starts to cast his abilities, the fire debuff from his auto attacks is going to fall off during the cast time. It can be good with Got a Light talent, since the targets will be on fire for a little bit longer, and your supercharged units will not stop to cast for as long of time as Hobgen stops to cast. On round 35, you get the option of modifying your ultimate abilities. So if you've picked Let's Go Crazy, you have the option of You Burnt and Fire Suppression. You Burnt, this talent doubles down on the long fight strength of Let's Go Crazy. The longer the fight goes, the more auto attacks are going to come out, which means the more burn damage over time is going to be applied. If you picked Let's Go Crazy, that probably means that you're opting into these longer fights, and that means you probably want to pick up You Burnt as well. Fire Suppression, this could be better than You Burnt against opponents with healing, since it starts to take effect as soon as the fight starts, as soon as they get on fire from that first initial auto attack, rather than waiting until his ultimate cast at 100 hype. If most opponents have no healing though, this is obviously not going to be a very useful talent. Sticky Strikes is a modification to Friendly Fire, and it makes it excel at long fights as well. Typically, Friendly Fire only excels at quick bursts of damage, but then the longer the fight goes on, Let's Go Crazy kind of edges it out. But Sticky Strike makes it a great long-term damage output option as well, and this should definitely be the default choice for Friendly Fire. Danger Close will increase your hit rate on Friendly Fire, since it'll only target the enemy side of the board, but by the time Friendly Fire is cast, the fights are often chaotic enough and units are spread out onto both sides of the board. If your opponents are playing Hunters or Mages though, they're most likely going to be sticking to their own side, since they're started on that side and they're ranged, so they're not inclined to move, so this could be a good talent option against those type of builds. Let's talk a little bit about the positioning tips. Now, positioning Hobgen is pretty straightforward. He is a ranged unit who just prefers to be in the backline, protected from most opponents, and so you can position him pretty similarly to other ranged units. The only special consideration is the targeting for his supercharged ability, which targets the closest allied hero. In cases where Hobgen is away from the edge of the board, he's going to target units adjacent to him in the following order. The first unit he's going to target is directly in front of him, and then it's going to go clockwise on adjacency, but not diagonals. He gets to the diagonals second. It's like a really weird, like northeast, southwest, and then northwest, southeast, or southwest, southeast. You know, it's on the screen there. It's a really weird targeting algorithm, but generally, if you have a couple units, you want them either in the front or in the right of him in order to optimally target that. There are some edge cases where he's on the corners or edges of the board where it'll slightly alter his targeting order for the supercharged. If he's on the left corner of the board, he's going to target directly in front, and then right, and then behind him. But then instead of continuing kind of in the same order as before, he's going to jump to the top right as his fourth preferred target, and then the back right for his fifth preferred target. If he's in the back corner, he targets directly in front and then directly to the right of him, kind of going with this like perpendicular. He doesn't like diagonals until very late in the targeting preference. And then similarly, it's mirrored on the opposite side of the board with the same kind of pattern where he targets in front and then on the side and then behind him. And then, of course, in the back right corner, same concept. So you can use these ideas of like where he's going to prefer to target so that you can hopefully get this supercharged onto a key carry such as Troll Warlord or Venomancer. But of course, units are going to move and fights are going to be a little chaotic, so you can't always perfectly control this targeting. So that's it for this guide. I just want to say that Hobgen is really a late game beast, certainly in comparison to an Essex, who's much more of an early game focused Underlord. He pairs very well with Savages or Mages, but he's got so many different talent choices and so many different ways of playing him that he is very, very flexible. I hope you found this guide useful, and if so, please do like, subscribe, and you can also follow me on Twitch, where I stream almost every day at twitch.tv/tinman354. And also a big thanks to my Patreon supporters. If you like content like this and want to see more of it, consider supporting me over on patreon.com/tinman354. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.